The sound that morning wasn't boots or orders, nine, it was crying. Soft, high, and human. Not the sound of soldiers, but of infants. Helene Vogel stood still at the edge of the compound, her hands frozen around a blanket she hadn't yet finished sewing. The desert wind stung her face, turning the corners of her eyes raw. Around her, the other women stared too, thin, hollow, and silent. They had expected shouting, punishment, maybe worse. What they didn't expect was the faint smell of milk. Across the yard, 2 American medics climbed down from a truck. One carried tin pails, the other a wooden crate with glass bottles clinking softly inside. Behind them came a nurse in khaki sleeves rolled high, her hair pinned neatly, her steps careful on the dirt. She wasn't armed. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the pregnant women, Marta, barely 20, stepped forward, trembling. The nurse knelt before her, opened the crate, and held out a bottle. Steam drifted from the glass. Warm, she said simply. For the baby. Marta blinked, unsure whether to take it. Helene felt her throat tighten, something breaking loose inside her chest. Disbelief. Fear, maybe hope. Someone whispered in German, "It's a trick." But no one stepped back. The nurse waited. Patient, kind, almost fragile herself in the white sun. Then, slowly, Marta reached out. Her hands closed around the bottle. The smell of milk spread across the yard. Soft. Ordinary, impossible. And for the first time since capture, the women felt something they hadn't dared to feel since the war began. They felt safe. The morning after the milk delivery, the camp didn't sound the same. No barking orders. No metallic clang of weapons. Only the wind pushing against the barracks and, from somewhere near the infirmary, the muffled cry of a newborn. Helene didn't move for a long time. The others were still watching the fence, expecting some correction, some reversal, as if kindness itself had been a mistake that would soon be punished. But the soldiers didn't shout. They came with buckets of water, soap, and clean cloth instead. The camp nurse, everyone now knew her name was Corporal Mary Allen, worked quietly, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hands steady even when her voice trembled from exhaustion. She spoke English softly, slower when she realized some of the women understood pieces of it. When she passed Helene's bunk, she smiled, small, polite, not the smile of pity, but something warmer. "You can help, right? You look like you know what you're doing." Helene hesitated, then nodded. Back home, before the war, she'd worked in a small hospital in Bremen. She hadn't touched a patient since 1943, when the bombings began and the wards filled with dying soldiers. Now, she found herself kneeling beside an American nurse, folding bandages. The air smelled of antiseptic and dust. In the corner, a young mother, Lisbeth, clutched her baby like a secret. The child's skin was too pale, lips faintly blue. Helene saw it instantly. Underfed, dehydrated. She reached for a bottle, but her hands shook. Mary steadied her. "Slow, the milk's warm. Small sips first." Helene tilted the bottle carefully, watching the infant's mouth latch. A faint gurgle, then the tiniest swallow. The room went silent. Someone whispered, "She's drinking." For the first time in months, Helene's body remembered what it felt like to help, instead of survive. By noon, the camp's rhythm had changed. Guards leaned their rifles against posts, helping unload wooden crates instead. The Red Cross insignia was painted on the sides, white against dusty wood, so bright it almost looked holy. Inside the boxes, blankets, bottles, aspirin, and something that made the women gasp. Small white tins labeled powdered milk. U.S. Army supply. Lisbeth wept when she saw it. Not loudly, just a small, breathless sound that broke everyone's silence. Helene didn't cry. She couldn't. Her tears had long ago burned out with the city that used to be her home. But she felt something else rise in her throat. Gratitude mixed with guilt. Why were they being saved by the people they had been told were monsters? Later that afternoon, when the sun turned the fence wires gold, Helene walked outside. A few American soldiers stood by the gate, sharing cigarettes. One of them, a young man with a southern accent, nodded toward her. "You ladies need anything, you just tell the nurse." Helene didn't answer. English still felt like a foreign wound on her tongue. But she raised her hand slightly. Not quite a wave, not quite surrender. He smiled anyway. That night, when the desert cooled, the women gathered near the barracks window. From outside came faint music, a harmonica, slow and uneven. The Americans were playing. Helene closed her eyes. The tune was something soft like a lullaby. For a moment she could almost believe she was home again, before the uniforms, before the hunger. Lisbeth whispered, "Do you think they know what they're doing?" Helene opened her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Feeding us. Helping us." "Maybe it's just orders." Helene looked back toward the faint light of the infirmary. Mary Allen was still there, bending over a cradle she'd built from an apple crate, her shadow moving gently back and forth. "No," Helene said quietly. "Orders don't look like that." The women didn't sleep much that night. Some prayed. Some hummed songs they hadn't dared to sing in years. Others just stared at their hands, cracked, thin but suddenly useful again. Outside, the harmonica played until the wind swallowed the sound. And in the stillness that followed, Helene realized something she hadn't since the war began. Fear could fade just like hunger. Slowly, quietly, one act of mercy at a time. By the third day, the camp had a rhythm again. Only this time it wasn't military. It was human. The women woke before sunrise, not to roll call, but to the sound of bottles clinking in metal basins. Corporal Mary Allen had transformed one of the storage huts into something resembling a clinic. Beds were lined with clean sheets. Soap and boiled water replaced the smell of sweat and fear. Helene helped sterilize cloth in a dented tin pot, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back the way she used to in the hospital years ago. Her hands still trembled sometimes, but the tremors weren't from fear anymore. They were from purpose. Outside, an American soldier, Private Dawson, hammered together what looked like a crib made from fruit crates. He worked clumsily, his uniform soaked in sweat, but his expression was patient, even careful. When one of the German women approached to watch, he grinned and said something none of them fully understood. But the tone was enough, friendly, unthreatening, human. By mid-morning, the clinic had its first patient, a woman named Greta, due any day. Helene helped her inside while Mary prepared towels and a cot. The nurse's English words mixed with Helene's German, fragments of instruction, reassurance, prayer. Hours later, the cry of a newborn filled the air again. This time, everyone heard it, even the guards. A few stopped what they were doing, listening with the same startled quiet that had fallen over the women days before. When Mary stepped outside, her arms cradling the baby, no one spoke. She just smiled, eyes shining in the dry light. "It's a boy," she said. Greta sobbed softly, hands over her mouth. The sound broke through something invisible that had separated the two sides. One of the American medics, a broad-shouldered man with freckles, stepped forward and handed her a folded blanket. "From my wife," he said gently. "She sent too many." Greta took it with shaking hands. Helene stood beside her, speechless. She'd watched people die. She'd seen whole wards emptied in hours. But watching someone live, really live, inside a prison camp felt like witnessing a miracle in reverse. Over the next week, more crates arrived. Powdered milk, vitamins, soap, baby bottles with tiny rubber nipples. The Red Cross emblem was stamped across every package. A clean white cross that almost glowed under the desert sun. The women began to whisper about the Americans, not as enemies, but as something harder to name. They still didn't smile much. Smiling felt dangerous, like weakness. But there were small changes. A shared nod. A quick "thank you" whispered in broken English. An instinct to protect instead of resist. Helene noticed something else too. Mary was changing. Her posture had softened, her voice steadier. She stopped calling them the women and began using names. When she mispronounced them, she'd laugh and try again. One evening, while washing instruments by lantern light, Mary spoke quietly. "You worked in medicine before the war, didn't you?" Helene hesitated, then nodded. "A nurse." "Bremen General," Mary smiled faintly. "Figured." "You handle scissors better than my own recruits." Helene's lips twitched in the beginning of a smile. "And you handle fear better than mine." They laughed. Short, cautious, but real. Outside, the desert wind swept through the camp, carrying a sound the women had almost forgotten. The giggle of a child. One of the babies, not even a week old, had discovered her own voice. Mary looked up. "That sound right there," she said softly. "That's victory." Helene nodded. "For both sides." The next morning, word spread that a photographer from the local paper might visit. The Americans wanted proof that the POW camp treated its prisoners well. The women panicked at first. Photographs meant records, exposure, risk. But when the time came, they stood in a quiet row outside the clinic. Mary stood beside them, not as a guard, but as one of them. In the photo, the women looked tired, thin, cautious, but behind the exhaustion, something has shifted. You can almost see it in their eyes, that fragile, invisible thread between fear and faith. When the photographer left, Helene sat by the window, sketching the scene in a small notebook Mary had given her. A simple drawing, a baby's cradle, a soldier's hand, a bottle on a table. Underneath, she wrote a single word in German, Leben, life. That night, before lights out, she tore out the page and slipped it under Mary's door. No note, no explanation, just the drawing. Mary found it the next morning and kept it folded in her breast pocket all day. Neither of them spoke about it. They didn't need to. Some kindness didn't need translation. The desert was quieter now. The clang of tools, the bark of commands, all had softened into the steady rhythm of living. By late summer, the clinic smelled of boiled linens and soap, not fear. The babies were growing fast, round-faced and loud, their cries echoing through the camp like a strange kind of music. Helene had begun keeping notes, weights, feeding times, temperatures, the habits of a nurse returning to herself. She wrote in both German and broken English, the words cramped and careful, as if afraid they might vanish if she didn't pin them down. Mary often read over her shoulder, smiling. "You write better English than most of my soldiers," she'd joke. Helene would shake her head. "You haven't seen my soldiers." The laughter between them was soft but real. It carried across language. One morning, an American officer arrived with orders. The POW mothers could write letters home. The Red Cross would censor them, of course, but the words could still travel. Small miracles sealed in envelopes. The women crowded around the table, pencils trembling in their hands. For most, it had been years since they'd written to anyone not wearing a uniform. Helene's first line was simple, "I am alive." Then she hesitated, staring at the blank space that followed. What else could she say? That the enemy brought her milk? That an American nurse sat by her bed every night, humming lullabies from another country? She settled on, "The world is not what we were told." Across the table, Greta was drawing small hearts in the margins. "They won't like that," Helene murmured. Greta smiled weakly. "They'll think it's code." That afternoon, a jeep rolled in carrying supplies and in something unexpected. A phonograph player, dented and dusty, but still working. Private Dawson set it on a crate and cranked the handle. A scratchy tune spilled into the air. Slow, brass-heavy, full of longing. Glenn Miller. The music drifted through the camp like sunlight. For a moment, no one spoke. The women just stood there, eyes wide, as if the sound itself was forbidden. Then Lisbeth laughed, an unguarded, bright sound that startled everyone. Mary clapped her hands. "Come on, you know this one?" Helene didn't, but she could feel the rhythm. Her body remembered dancing. Before ration cards, before war. Dawson extended a hand toward her, half smiling. "Truce?" She hesitated, then took it. It wasn't a dance, really. Just two people swaying in dust and sunlight, moving to music that didn't care which side they'd fought for. Around them, the others clapped in time, their faces open and alive in a way Helene hadn't seen since before the war. When the song ended, Dawson gave a small bow. "You lead better than my sergeant," Helene laughed. "You should tell your sergeant that," he grinned. "He'd shoot me." From the barracks window, Mary watched, her eyes soft. Later that night, she told Helene quietly, "You know, if anyone had told me I'd be midwife to Germans, I'd have laughed," Helene replied. "If anyone had told me I'd thank an American, I'd have done the same." They shared a look, the kind built not from words but from what both had seen and lost. The next morning, one of the infants, Greta's boy, fell ill. Fever, shallow breathing. Panic rippled through the camp like wind through dry grass. Mary worked fast. Helene assisted, boiling water, pressing damp cloths to the child's skin. For hours, the only sound was the baby's labored breaths. Outside, the soldiers waited. Even they felt it as that heavy stillness that comes when hope hangs by a thread. At sunset, the fever broke. The child whimpered once, then slept. Helene leaned back, tears streaking the dust on her face. Mary's hands were trembling. She reached over and squeezed Helene's arm. "You saved him," Mary whispered. Helene shook her head. "We did." Outside, the camp exhaled, a soundless sigh that spread from tent to tent. Later, when the sky turned black and the stars came out sharp and cold, Helene stood alone by the fence. On the other side, an American guard played the harmonica again, the same slow tune as before. She didn't recognize the song, but she knew what it meant. It meant the world was changing, not through speeches or surrenders, but through small mercies, one heartbeat at a time. Behind her, the clinic's lantern flickered. Inside, babies slept beside mothers who no longer feared waking up, and for the first time in years, Helene didn't feel like a prisoner. She just felt alive. The wind came first and low and restless. By noon, it had turned into a wall of dust rolling over the horizon, swallowing the sun. The guard shouted, slamming shutters and latching doors. The sky dimmed into a strange burnt orange. Inside the clinic, Helene felt the floorboards tremble. "A storm?" she asked. Mary glanced out the window, already tying back her hair. "Arizona kind. It'll pass. But we've got another problem." On the cot lay Frida, one of the younger prisoners, her face pale, breath short. She'd gone into labor hours too soon. Mary moved quickly. Towels, hot water, morphine. "This one's early. We'll need to watch the breathing." Helene's heartbeat quickened. "Too early?" "Too early," Mary said quietly. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the walls. Dust seeped through every crack, painting the air in ghostly light. Private Dawson appeared at the door, bandana over his mouth. "You ladies need help?" Mary didn't look up. "Get more lamps. The power might go." He nodded and disappeared into the wind. Minutes later, the storm hit full force. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 hands clawing at the walls. The light dimmed to gray, then to near darkness. Helene worked by touch more than sight, wiping Frida's forehead, whispering German prayers she barely remembered. The baby came too fast. Too small, not breathing. Mary froze for half a second, then began chest compressions with the precision of someone who refused to surrender. "Come on, little one," she murmured, her voice low but steady. "Come on." Helene leaned close, whispering the same in German. "Bitte." "Atma, please breathe." Outside, lightning flashed, brief, white, holy. For one heartbeat, Helene saw the baby's tiny chest rise. Then again, then a cry, thin but fierce, cutting through the storm like a bell. Mary sat back, eyes wet. "He's breathing." Helene laughed, sharp, breathless, disbelieving. "He's alive." For a long time, neither moved. Dust coated their faces, their hair, even the cradle they'd built from Dawson's old fruit crates. But none of it mattered. Life had found a way again. When the storm finally broke, the camp was unrecognizable. Sand piled against walls, the flagpole bent sideways, the horizon still hazy. The soldiers walked the perimeter, coughing through their scarves. Inside the clinic, the air smelled of earth and sweat and something cleaner. Renewal. Mary held the baby gently, rocking him back and forth. "He'll need a name," she said softly. Helene smiled faintly. "Frida will choose. But maybe something American this time, yes?" Mary laughed. "Maybe something German I can actually pronounce." For the first time, they both laughed without hesitation. Later that evening, the soldiers came to help clean. One of them, Webb, the quiet one with kind eyes, brought a thermos of coffee for the nurses. "You folks just saved a miracle," he said. Helene looked at the baby sleeping in the cradle, dust still clinging to his cheeks. "No," she replied softly. "We just held on long enough for one." When the lights came back, the camp felt different again. The storm had erased footprints, flattened fences, covered the hard lines between them in the same coat of sand. As Helene walked outside, she realized the wind had done what politics and speeches never could. It made everyone equal. Every tent, every uniform, every face was covered in the same desert dust. For the first time, the guards didn't stand above them. They stood with them, sharing rations, laughter, exhaustion. That night, Dawson brought out the harmonica again, its surface dull and scratched, but still singing. The tune was slow, almost a lullaby. The mothers hummed softly, rocking their babies in rhythm. Mary leaned against the doorway, eyes closed. "You ever think," she said, "maybe mercy's contagious?" Helene nodded. "Like a fever, but one we shouldn't cure." The stars had returned, clear and endless above the camp. For the first time, the women didn't look at them through wire, just open air. Helene felt the baby's faint breathing against her arm, fragile but steady. And she thought, maybe this is what victory sounds like. Not cheers or anthems, but a single heartbeat surviving the storm. By September, the war felt distant, like an echo fading across the ocean. The guards no longer carried rifles during the day. The fences still stood, but no one looked at them anymore. The women had grown stronger. The babies were plump, loud, and endlessly curious, their laughter chasing away the ghosts that had once haunted every corner of the camp. Helene found herself smiling more. She worked beside Mary each morning, mixing powdered milk, changing dressings, teaching the younger women how to hold their children without fear. Sometimes, she even forgot she was a prisoner. Letters began to arrive that month, thin, pale envelopes with censor stamps. The first came from Greta's mother, written in trembling script. "I heard you live. I pray the child does too." Others were less hopeful. News of cities gone, fathers missing, families scattered. But even those letters felt like pieces of the world returning, proof that life existed beyond the wire. Helene's own letter came late. It bore her brother's handwriting, one she hadn't seen since before the bombing of Bremen. "I thought you dead," it began. "If you are alive, then the world is not lost." She folded it neatly and tucked it inside her apron pocket, reading it again every night until the paper felt like fabric. The Americans had changed too. Dawson no longer flinched when the women spoke German. Webb, the quiet one, had learned how to say Guten Morgen without butchering it. Even the officer who once barked orders now stopped by the clinic just to see the babies. "Hard to believe these kids were born behind a fence," he said one day. "They don't look like prisoners," Mary smiled. "They aren't." By then, rumors were spreading, transport papers, releases, repatriation lists. The camp buzzed with half hope and half fear. Freedom was coming, but it no longer meant what it used to. One evening, Helene stood outside the clinic, watching the sunset blur the desert into gold. Mary joined her, sipping coffee from a tin mug. "They'll send you home soon," Mary said quietly. Helene nodded. "Yes, home." The word felt heavy. "If there's still one." Mary hesitated, then asked, "You'll miss this place?" Helene looked around. The worn tents, the humming generator, the faint sound of babies crying somewhere in the distance. "I'll miss the part where I remembered who I was," she said. Mary smiled sadly. "You'll be a nurse again, somewhere." Helene shook her head. "No, I'll be human again. That's harder." They stood in silence until the sky turned violet. That night, the Americans organized something no one expected, a small celebration. Not for victory, not for propaganda, but for the mothers. They brought out what food they could spare, biscuits, coffee, even a few cans of peaches. Someone strung lanterns between two poles, and the harmonica came out again. When the first song began, the babies gurgled in rhythm, their mothers swaying softly. The guards clapped along, awkward but smiling. Dawson approached Helene with 2 paper cups. "Coffee," he said. "Not exactly champagne, but close," she laughed. "Better. I remember champagne, and it never came with peace." He looked at her for a long moment. "You'll do fine out there," she shrugged. "I was a stranger before the war. I'll be one again." The harmonica changed tune, slower now, sadder. A lullaby. Helene felt a lump rise in her throat. She turned away before Dawson could see the tears. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, she walked alone to the fence. Beyond it, the desert stretched endless in silver under the moonlight. She thought of her brother's letter, of Mary's laughter, of the nurse's steady hands covered in dust and blood and milk. She whispered into the wind, "Danke." It wasn't for one person. It was for all of it, the fear, the mercy, the strange grace that had lived behind the wire. The next morning, orders arrived. The first convoy would leave in 3 days. Mary found Helene sitting by the clinic window, folding baby blankets. "You'll need to pack," Mary said softly. Helene smiled faintly. "Everything I need I already carry." She handed Mary a small folded note, a drawing, simple and careful. 2 women, one German, one American, standing beside a crib. Mary unfolded it, tears glinting. "I'll keep this," she whispered. Helene stood, adjusting her uniform. So will I. Outside, the convoy engines rumbled awake. The babies stirred. The camp, for the first time, felt less like a cage and more like a memory already fading into light. The morning of departure came too soon. The desert was still half dark, the horizon painted in gray and silver. Engines rumbled softly in the distance. Trucks lined up beyond the fence, their metal sides streaked with sand and dawn light. Helene folded her blanket one last time. The barracks looked smaller now, like the memory of a place she'd already begun to leave. Around her, the other women whispered to their children, adjusting scarves, checking bags, hearts caught between relief and grief. Mary was already at the gate, clipboard in hand, calling out names. Her voice stayed firm, but her eyes were red. Greta Vogel. Here. Lisbeth Bauer. Here. One by one, the women stepped forward, holding their babies tight. Each had been given a small paper tag stamped repatriation order. Civilian POW transfer. The handwriting was foreign, but the meaning was clear. They were going home. When Mary reached Helene's name, her voice caught slightly. Helene Vogel. Helene stepped forward, baby on her hip. Present, she said, using the English word. Mary smiled. Never thought I'd hear you say that like a soldier. Never thought I'd feel like one, Helene replied. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from holding tears too long. Dawson helped them load the luggage. The soldiers handled the bags gently, not like cargo, but like something sacred. One even rocked a baby while Greta climbed aboard, muttering in German about big American hands and small German children. When everyone was seated, Mary climbed up to the truck's step and looked out at them. Her khaki uniform was creased, dust clinging to her sleeves, a strand of hair loose by her cheek. You'll have good lives, she said. Don't let anyone tell you this didn't matter. No one answered, but Helene felt every word sink deep. Mary hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, Helene's drawing. I never gave you anything back, she said. Helene smiled faintly. You gave me milk and mercy. I think that's enough, Mary blinked hard. Keep something for me then. She took off her small nurse's pin, the one shaped like a silver cross, and pressed it into Helene's hand. Not a souvenir, she said softly. A promise. To stay kind, Helene nodded. Always. The engines roared to life. Dust rose around the trucks like a curtain. Babies began to cry, startled by the noise, maybe sensing that something final was happening. Mary stepped back as the convoy rolled forward. Dawson raised a hand in salute. The women waved back, faces pressed to the open slats. Helene kept her eyes on the shrinking figure of the nurse until the camp was nothing but a line of pale tents and sunlight. No one spoke for miles. The road wound through endless desert, the color of bone and memory. Lisbeth broke the silence first. Do you think they'll forget us? Helene looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. No, she said. They'll remember, just not the way we think. What way is that? Helene gazed out at the empty horizon, as proof that mercy survives wars better than soldiers do. Hours later, they stopped by a small outpost for inspection. The air smelled of gasoline and sagebrush. A young American officer checked their papers, barely glancing at the names. Headed for the port, he said. You'll be home soon. Home. The word no longer felt certain. Home was not a place anymore. It was the faces they were leaving behind, the laughter, the lullabies, the kindness that had found them in captivity. As the truck started again, Helene reached into her pocket. The silver nurse's pin glinted in her palm, still warm from Mary's touch. She pinned it to her collar, just beneath the Red Cross stamp of her transport pass. The wind picked up, blowing dust through the truck's wooden slats. It carried the faint smell of milk. Real or imagined, she couldn't tell. When the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the desert, Helene looked back one last time. There was no camp, no wire, no garden, only open space and silence. She smiled through her tears. Goodbye, America, she whispered. You taught us how to be soft again. The truck rolled on, wheels grinding against gravel, carrying the women toward ships, toward home, toward another uncertain peace. But somewhere behind them, in a camp that no longer existed, a nurse stood by an empty crib, humming to the ghosts of babies who had been born free, even behind fences. The train ride through Germany was silent. No one spoke as the ruined cities passed by. windows blown out, chimneys like broken fingers pointing at nothing. Smoke still rose from some streets, though the war had been over for months. Helene sat by the window, her baby asleep against her shoulder. The rattle of the tracks blended with distant church bells, the only sound of life left in a country learning to breathe again. When the train stopped at Bremen, she almost didn't step off. The station she remembered was gone, just stone, steel, and the smell of ashes. She carried the child down the platform, past lines of dazed faces waiting for loved ones who would never arrive. She found her brother at the edge of the crowd. He was thinner, older, but alive. "Helene?" She nodded, and they embraced without words. For a long moment, she could hear nothing but his heartbeat, steady, familiar, human. They walked through streets where every house looked the same, hollowed out, gray, stripped of meaning. But inside one, rebuilt from scraps of brick and timber, a pot of soup simmered. Her brother's wife handed her a bowl without asking questions. "You were a prisoner?" she said softly. "Yes. Did they hurt you?" Helene looked down at the baby in her arms. Healthy, sleeping, his small hand clutching her collar. "No," she said quietly. "They saved me." Her sister-in-law blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Helene smiled faintly. "Americans. A nurse, milk, medicines, they saved us all." That night, Helene couldn't sleep. The city outside was too quiet, too empty. She stood by the window, watching the moonlight fall across the rubble. Somewhere, she thought, Mary Allen was probably doing the same, looking at a sky that belonged to both of them. In the morning, she walked to what used to be Bremen General Hospital. Only half the building stood. The rest was open air and brick dust. Inside, a few nurses were rebuilding what they could. Helene offered her help. They hesitated. One looked at her worn clothes, the Red Cross pin still shining faintly on her collar. "You worked in medicine before?" She nodded. And during, and after, they handed her gloves and she began again. Days turned to weeks. The work was endless, tending to malnourished children, wounded refugees, men too broken to remember who they were. But it felt familiar, necessary. In the evenings, she'd pull out her small notebook, the one Mary had given her in the camp, and sketch faces. Not of pain, but of survival. One drawing she made over and over, 2 women standing over a cradle, a baby sleeping between them. She could never decide who looked more tired, the German or the American, so she stopped shading the difference. Years passed. The child grew. The world moved on. In 1950, she received a letter from America. The handwriting was neat, careful, but unfamiliar. "Dear Mrs. Vogel, this letter may come as a surprise. My name is Catherine Allen. My mother, Corporal Mary Allen, served at Camp Florence during the war. She often spoke of a nurse named Helene, who helped her deliver the first German babies in captivity. She kept your drawing on her desk until the day she passed." Helene sat down slowly, the letter trembling in her hands. "She said you reminded her that mercy doesn't wear a uniform. I wanted you to know she never forgot." Tears fell quietly onto the paper, darkening the ink. Helene folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her notebook. Beside the last drawing she'd made of Mary, the one she'd never shown anyone. That evening, she walked to the edge of the city, where the river met the ruins. She sat on a low wall, the wind tugging at her hair. The water shimmered faintly in the dusk, carrying bits of wood, leaves, forgotten things. She took off the silver nurse's pin, still polished, still bright, and held it in her palm. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Then she placed it in the water. The current carried it away, glinting like a star until it disappeared beneath the ripples. For a long time she sat there, eyes closed, listening to the sound of the river and the echo of a harmonica she could still hear in her memory. Not a song of war. A lullaby, and when she finally rose to leave, she felt lighter, as if she had laid the last of the war to rest. Winter sunlight spilled across the shop window. Helene, now gray-haired and slower in her movements, adjusted the sign that read, "Closed for Sunday." Her little bakery in Bremen had become a quiet corner of the city, a place where the smell of warm bread and sugar greeted anyone who walked in. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the cold air, soft as ash. Inside, the shelves were half empty, the ovens cooling, the clock ticking steadily above the door. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the small photograph on the counter, faded, creased, but still clear. It showed a row of women standing in the Arizona desert, babies in their arms, sunlight glaring off the metal roofs behind them. She was one of them. Next to the photo sat a tiny silver pin, dull now, edges worn smooth. She picked it up, turning it between her fingers. Time had blurred the details, but she could still feel the weight of it. The warmth from another hand that had once pressed it into hers. A bell chimed as the door opened. "Grandmother," a voice called softly. Her grandson, Eric, stepped inside, brushing snow off his coat. He was a young man now, tall, bright-eyed, curious about things the world had long since forgotten. He placed a paper on the counter. "My history teacher asked for family stories from the war. You never told me yours?" Helene smiled faintly. "Some stories are too soft for history books." "Too soft?" he asked, puzzled. She nodded, glancing at the photograph. Yes, they wouldn't believe them. He followed her gaze. "Who are they?" "Friends," she said. "And strangers, both." She poured him a cup of cocoa the same way the American nurse had poured warm milk so many years before. The smell filled the air, sweet and familiar. "You were in America, weren't you?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "As a prisoner," he froze. "A prisoner?" She smiled gently. "It wasn't what you think. We expected barbed wire, cruelty, hunger. What we found was—" She paused, searching for the word. "That kindness. The kind that leaves a mark you never wash away." Eric leaned forward, fascinated. "Did you ever go back?" "To America?" She shook her head. "No, but I never really left it either." He frowned. "How can you not leave a place you never returned to?" Helene looked out the window, watching the snow. "Because some places stay inside you, not the land but the people. The ones who showed you what mercy looked like when the world forgot it." Silence filled the shop. The clock ticked. The snow kept falling. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a small leather notebook. Edges frayed, pages yellowing. "This," she said, "is my piece of that place." He opened it carefully. Inside were sketches. Faces, cradles, hands, bottles, laughter. And near the back, one drawing labeled Camp Florence, 1945. Two women standing beside a crib, smiling at a baby between them. Eric traced the lines with his fingertip. "You drew this?" Helene nodded. "With the same pencil they gave me to write my first letter home." He stared at the page in awe. "You never told anyone?" "No," she said softly. "Some memories grow better in silence. Like seeds." He looked at her, then back at the drawing. "Do you miss them?" "Every day," she said. "But not sadly. Mercy doesn't die with people. It passes on, through hands, through small things," as she gestured toward him. "Like this. You're here because someone believed compassion was worth the risk." He looked down, his eyes bright. "I'll tell your story, Grandma," she smiled faintly. "No, tell their story. The mothers. The nurse. The soldiers who learned to care for their enemies. Mine is just a page in theirs." He nodded slowly, understanding more than his words could hold. As he turned to leave, she stopped him. "Eric?" He looked back. "When you tell it," she said, "don't make it about war. Make it about what survived." He smiled. "Mercy?" She nodded. "Yes. Mercy." The doorbell jingled again as he stepped outside, the cold air rushing in for a moment before the door closed. Helene stood still, the sound of snow muffling everything beyond the window. She looked once more at the silver pin, the photograph, the notebook, the relics of a chapter that had begun in dust and ended in warmth. Then she blew out the last lamp, plunging the shop into soft shadow. The smell of sugar lingered, and for a long time she stood by the window, watching the snowfall dissolve against the glass, and each flake unique, fleeting, and merciful.